So today's International Women's Day, and we are here all to celebrate a number of the achievements that have already been spoken about. Each one of us remember International Women's Day in our own particular and special way. I remember International Women's Day through a meeting, an encounter that I had in East Timor. It was International Women's Day in 2011, and I suggested that rather than stay in the capital, that we go to the rural areas. So we went to a province called Aileo, and when we went there, a community meeting was already in progress. Watched as the meeting took place, and then a young woman was introduced as the mayor. Very unusual. This woman got up to speak, and I remember I was so impressed with her confidence. Her diction was so clear. She spoke with passion. She was talking about a center that she had opened for abused and women who were victims of domestic abuse in East Timor. So at the end of the event, I had the opportunity to sit with her, and I asked her to tell me a little bit about herself and how she had achieved this position of responsibility, which was so unusual for a woman. And she smiled shyly and she said, "You know, I was a very shy and retiring person." She said, "But a few years ago, some women coaxed me into going to a week-long training session on women's empowerment in a nearby village that the UN mission in Timor was undertaking." And she said, "That week was life-changing for me." She said, "As I sat and listened to people talk about women's rights," she said, "I reflected that I, too, as a woman, have human rights. That I can speak for women who don't have the voice to speak." And so she said that propelled her into a career where she ran for local offices, competed in district-level elections, and ultimately came to the position where she was as mayor. And she talked about the difficulties that she faced in trying to establish this shelter for abused and battered women. She said there were blocks in her way at every turn. She said the men felt very threatened about what such a shelter would do to the community. But with the help of some missionary nuns in the area, she was able to open the shelter. And the fact that they did this by themselves as an East Timorese woman just spread, the word spread about her success. And many men and women from different parts of East Timor were coming to learn from her example about how things could be made to happen. So to me, this embodies International Women's Day. The fact that a woman herself recognizes her own human rights and is also the voice for many women who don't have the courage to do so, but that resolve to change the world for women. Now, this encounter in itself, I think, embodies very much what we're here to talk about today, women in peacekeeping. East Timor was a post-conflict country. It was ravaged by war. Its institutions were all broken. There are many different facets of women in peacekeeping, but given the constraints of time today, I will focus on 3 areas. One is on women as victims of conflict. The second is the role that women can play in stabilizing their communities in a post-conflict situation. And the third is the role of the international community and the leadership role that the international community should bring to bear in these situations of conflict. So let me focus on, first, the issue which relates to women being victims of conflict. I was the humanitarian coordinator in Darfur in Sudan from 2007 to 2009. During that time, it was the largest humanitarian program of the United Nations. 2 million people had been displaced from their homes internally. 800,000 had fled the country to seek refuge in other countries. As in Darfur, but even now, today, in many conflicts that we see, be it in Iraq, in Syria, Yemen, South Sudan, the Rohingyas in Myanmar, women become victims because they become the subject of assault. Women are raped in these situations. Regular forces and irregular forces have assaulted the dignity of tens and thousands of women and girls in conflict. And very often this is used as a deliberate strategy to break the spirit of the struggle. So women become the silent victims in many conflict situations. Let me move now to the second issue that I talked about in terms of women being the ones who can help stabilize their communities in a post-conflict situation. And let me tell you about this situation both in Afghanistan and Sudan, where I served for almost a total of 7 years altogether. We had programs that were called Demobilization, Disarmament, and Reintegration. The acronym in the UN family is DDR. So at the end of a conflict, you find many of the militia, sometimes regular forces, but irregular forces and other militia, who were mobilized during the struggle into units who need to be demobilized. We find them at the end of the conflict in possession of weapons, arms, armaments, and we need to disarm them by providing some incentives that they would give up their arms. And finally, we need to train them and develop other skills so that they have a means of earning their livelihoods and reintegrating back into societies. So, notice that I said young men. In both, when I was in South Sudan, it was very interesting that the largest percentage of the government's budget in South Sudan went as monthly payments to veterans who had fought in the civil war. And it was not uncommon, for many of you who may have been in South Sudan, it was not uncommon when, as you traveled in the country, to see men sitting, sometimes drinking from early in the morning, sitting by the roadside, playing cards, because they got a monthly veterans benefit and really didn't see the need to take the effort to earn livelihoods. Now, as I said, notice that I said men. There are many women who participate in war. many women who participate in war. In South Sudan, many women accompanied these militia as cooks, as cleaners, as comfort women, in many other roles. But they are not recognized as veterans. So I was quite surprised when I went to East Timor, and again I was in a community, and someone introduced me to a woman and said she's a veteran and she receives a monthly benefit. And I was quite intrigued, and I asked her, what did you do during the struggle for independence? And she told me she was a courier. She used to take messages, at that time no cell phones. She used to take handwritten messages from one rebel leader to another. She used to hide these messages in the basket of fruit or rice or whatever she had, and she would convey these messages from one leader to another. The government recognized her role as a veteran and paid her a veteran's benefit. But that's not the end of my story. This woman, with her veteran's benefit, opened a kindergarten in her village that was free for all the children of that village to come and get an education. And she was able to mobilize the community. They gave her community land. They built a very simple structure for the school. She got women to come in and volunteer to grow fruit and vegetables, and mothers to come and give the children a meal at the school. So again, we can see the difference in the approach of women who want to use what they get for the welfare and the betterment of their families. And I saw this in Afghanistan as well, that women were so keen to have their, particularly the girls, sent back to school in the aftermath of the Taliban. The last issue that I want to talk to you about is the role of the international community. And of course, we've heard that in the year 2000, landmark resolution was passed, which called for the recognition of women's rights, that asked women to be participants at the negotiating table, and that also said one must plan in the post-conflict reconstruction era the involvement and participation and making sure that benefits accrue to women. And all this is great. But I think what behooves us, and I've been a leader in the United Nations myself, is that we have got to make sure that these are actually implemented. This resolution that was just passed is wonderful. I've been in Afghanistan where we have that mandate, but we have got to practice what we preach. I think that is absolutely critical. And in Afghanistan, I can tell you that the international community, when I was there in 2004, the international community held what was called a constitutional lawyer jirga. Lawyer jirga is really literally a big tent. You bring all the leaders of ethnic groups and minorities and tribal leaders and elders all together under one tent to try and arrive at conclusions about major issues facing the country. And so this was about the Constitution. In 2004, with the strong advocacy of UN leaders, NATO, ISAF, other international community, we were all able to impress upon the Afghans at the constitutional lawyer jirga to allot 28% of their seats in parliament, in the lower house and in the upper house, to women. And it was accepted. And we were all so happy that here in Afghanistan, a country that is just breaking from the shackles of the Taliban rule, will have at least 28% representation of women in the parliament. But what is also very important is that the country needs to be stable. In order for changes as fundamental as this to anchor and to sink in, one needs the stability and development to take place hand in hand. And unfortunately, as we all know, in Afghanistan, this isn't the case. So recently, there has been a vote to lower that percentage to 20%, which means that we are rolling back what we saw as progress, but the country wasn't able to accept it, and the development and the stability wasn't there to carry that decision forward. So very important that all of that goes hand in hand so that the gains that we saw for women are maintained. But let me also talk about the representation within the United Nations itself, since I have worked there myself. It was only in 2014 that Kirsten Lund became the first female force commander from Sweden, and she went to the mission in Cyprus. It was only in 2012 that Heather Paneras of South Africa became the first female police commissioner in Darfur. And I remember in 2011 when I attended, as a head of mission, I attended the Heads of Missions conference at that time. At that month, I happened to be the only female head of mission. So the group pictures, a number of men with me sort of sitting somewhere in the middle. Things are changing. And this Secretary General has made a commitment that his cabinet will be 50% female, and he has achieved that, and we congratulate him. But in peacekeeping and peace operations in general, and I think we have representations from the armed services here, that gender parity isn't in the armed services, and therefore it's very difficult to have that gender parity in the contributions of troop contributing countries. But if I can indulge in just a little bit of national pride, my country, Bangladesh, has sent all female contingents, police contingents, to Liberia, Haiti, and Congo, as have, I think we've seen Mongolia and India and some of the other countries. And also this past summer when I was in Bangladesh, I met the first 2 female fighter jet pilots in Bangladesh. And then I read recently that they have gone as part of Bangladesh's contribution to the Congo. Small steps, but again, I think these are the kinds of things that we need to push. And it is particularly those of us who are force commanders and who have been in leadership positions that we've just got to keep hammering away at it. Now, I must end my this part of the discussion by talking about the fact that the United Nations must not do any harm in the arenas and the theaters where they are operating. That when we serve under the blue flag, we must serve with the highest levels of integrity, of professionalism, of respect for the dignity and worth of the human person. And unfortunately, that is not the case with respect to sexual exploitation and abuse by the United Nations peacekeepers and civilians alike. And that we tarnish that image of the blue flag. We are sent to those countries to provide hope and solace. We cannot do harm in those countries. And what we need are better measures of accountability and transparency. And I think the past Secretary General and the present one are taking much stronger steps, and we must hold those into account, and swiftly. So I think for this afternoon, you have there the position of women who become victims in conflict, but you also see the role of women in rebuilding their communities. And finally, to say that if we in the international community want to help women on the outside, then the case must be made for change within. Thank you very much.